Welcome to the SOAS DevTrack podcast series. The DevTrack podcast series offers episodes covering critical conversations in international development with academics, researchers, and practitioners.
Welcome to this episode of the DevTrack podcast series. My name is Sara Stevano and I am a senior lecturer in economics at SOAS. Today I am in conversation with my wonderful colleague, Dr. Surbi Kesar. Surbi is a development economist researching labor and the informal economy, and she is particularly interested in studying why the structure of post-colonial economies is not getting transformed through economic growth and capitalist development. Surbi also looks at the relations between identities, by which we mean relations of power and inequality, and social exclusion in India. In fact, much of her work so far focuses on India. Surbi is also one of the most important thinkers on decolonizing economics and has done some groundbreaking work in this area too. Welcome, Surbi, to this podcast. I feel very privileged to work with you here at SOAS, and I'm looking forward to this conversation about the informal economy today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's an absolute pleasure and delight to be talking to you about this.
So let's start with the basics. What is informal economy, and can you explain how this concept came into being?
Thanks for that question. I think let's try to take a historical view of how informality comes into being. Usually, informality is often discussed in the literature or in conversation based on its various characteristics. For example, the economy that doesn't really pay taxes, which is precarious, etc., which is all fine, but they're characteristics of informal economy. So I think it's worth taking a step back and trying to understand how did informal economy come into being. And we'll start with some of the predominant theories of economic development, let's say from Arthur Lewis and the following modernization theories, wherein a less developed economy was characterized by an economic dualism comprising a huge traditional non-capitalist agricultural sector where much of the production process was organized using family labor, was low technology, was not profit-driven, was mainly subsistence-driven, etc. And that's also where much of the workers or the population derived its livelihood from. Along with this was another sector, which was a much smaller, modern, capitalist, industrial segment of the economy. And the idea was that with economic development, there would be a transformation of the economic structure from this dual sort of economy into a homogeneous modern capitalist economy along the lines of today's advanced economies. However, that did not come to fruition. And one of the big roadblocks in that entire story has been the informal economy. While workers did transition out of agriculture for many of these economies, what really happened was they weren't absorbed in this modern formal segment of the economy. Rather, many of them had to reproduce their livelihoods again as self-employed family-based production processes, but now not in agriculture or the old traditional kind of segments, but now even in industrial urban landscapes. There's huge proliferation that happened of this sort of production processes that were mainly family-based, without capital wage labor relationship, even within the urban segments of the economy, within the industrial segments of the economy, came to be known as informal economy. Funny story, ILO in 1980s, when saw this, basically sent what they called a bunch of missions to the developing economies and trying to understand these. And their paper notes that they discovered, quote unquote, the informal economy. So it's in that context that I think we should understand informal economy. Now, of course, with labor institutions being weakened across the world and the huge surplus of labor existing across the world, there has been an informalization of wage work as well. So what I was talking about is mainly the self-employed that come into being. But also, of course, there is the wage work aspect of it. And somewhere in between the two of them is sort of an Uberization and this new form of gig work, etc. emerging, which can be seen as somewhere in between a self-employed and a disguised wage worker. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in a while. But these two put together, these self-employed family-based production units and these informal wage workers who usually function with various precarious, tenuous wage contracts without having any long term benefits, is what came to be the informal economy. And it's important to hold that in a historical context of how that was a roadblock in what was expected to be the development process.
Thank you, Surbi. That was great. So clearly, the informal economy is all around us today in multiple ways. Can you explain how the persistence of informality is accounted for in mainstream literature? And are there any alternative explanations in the critical literature?
That's a very interesting question, Sarah, because informality has been a point of discussion and debate in a lot of global south economies, right? Because that was the dominant form of work that people knew in a lot of global south economies. And there have been debates of what would happen to these informal economies. Of course, within the mainstream literature was one of the dominant views has been what has been called the dualist view, which kind of aligns with the earlier dualism story that I was talking about, wherein the expectation still is that, look, yes, these people did inhabit the informal economy, but what you need is more economic growth of the industrial modern segment. And as that happens, these people would transition into this sector. So, in some sense, informal economy is that temporary holding ground of sorts. And this sort of a transition or capitalist transformation, or what we know in the mainstream literature as structural transformation, where we're basically talking about a full-fledged capitalist transition, was supposed to happen. Now, it could happen either by these small, informal, self-employed firms that I was talking about earlier, growing in and becoming larger firms themselves, or it could happen in other ways where the people who are working in these self-employed enterprises getting absorbed in the formal capitalist segment as formal wage workers. So the dualist view does acknowledge that there is a structural dualism, there's a dualist economy. However, considers that this would in fact go away with economic growth, and informal economy therefore is a temporary phenomenon. The other view, which one can sort of categorize as the continuum micro-entrepreneurialist view of the informal economy. And interestingly, this was a view that came in a lot of World Bank literature that was coming out towards 1780s and has become, in fact, quite dominant in the current understanding of informal economy. So herein, the idea is that actually there is no structural difference between the two segments of the economy. The structural difference being that the one sector, as I said earlier, is supposed to be more profit-driven, the formal sort of modern industrial segment, and the informal economy or other traditional segments mainly being subsistence-driven, not using wage labor, etc. They argued that, in fact, there's no difference in the structural logic of these two segments. The informal firms are, in fact, have the same sort of logic and micro-entrepreneurial spirit as the bigger formal capitalist segment. They, in fact, are small because they have certain sort of constraints that they are facing, etc., because of which they would be small. You just release those constraints to growth and things would be fine. So there's no structural distinction. In fact, some of the recent literature has even been arguing that you might prefer to remain informal because that allows you to escape sort of falling into a tax bracket. Or you may prefer to remain informal because you're your own boss in some ways. And literature, some of them have also argued that actually people in informal economy controlling for various characteristics might in fact give you better returns. This has not gone uncontested. There has been a lot of empirical literature that has contested it. So that's where broadly the two sets of strands within the mainstream can be characterized. Coming to the relatively critical and alternative literature, there as well, there are these two parts, again going to a continuum sort of understanding. They, of course, agree that the informal economy is quite precarious, but they argue that it exists mainly to serve the economic needs of the formal capitalist segments. What kind of economic needs could it be? It could be cheap raw materials, inputs, wage goods, labor, and keeping these sort of different inputs at a lower cost for whenever it is needed for the formal capitalist segment. So it's that economic need that it satisfies. However, there's other strands which basically argue that there is not this relationship of economic need. one of the frameworks in which I place my work is the framework based on the recent intervention by Kalyan Sanyal, who argues in his 2007 book that the way the development process in a lot of post-colonial economies, and his focus has been India, has been unfolding is such that while there is resources that are transferred from the traditional segment to the modern capitalist formal segment with economic growth, however, workers or people who were subsisting on these resources are not really absorbed in this modern segment. These people are excluded both from their traditional resources as well as from these expanding, growing segment of the economies. And therefore, this excluded mass is therefore having to forcefully reproduce its conditions of existence on the periphery with this informal segment. And he also argues that much of this informal economy, especially the workers, the labor in this informal economy, is pretty much surplus to the needs of capital. In fact, much of this segment is something that serves a political need. And that political need is in terms of providing subsistence to a large population that the expanding capitalist modern segment doesn't even need anymore. And in absence of providing these sources of livelihood, they could potentially destabilize the economic system. And, a lot of what we see right now as an increase in microcredit loans, cash transfers, etc., can be seen as ways through which the subsistence of this economy can be ensured.
Great. Thank you, Surbi. So you just mentioned how you position your work particularly as building on Sanyal's work on post-colonial capitalism, and his work focused on India, much as your work. So focusing on India, can you tell us a bit more about the nature of the persistence of the informal economy in India particularly?
Thanks for that question, Sarah. India is a very interesting case study, I feel, in these debates because since sort of mid-90s, it has been experiencing a very high and sustained economic growth, of course, with some blips with COVID and demonetization, etc. However, despite this high economic growth for a relatively sustained period of time, India has experienced a huge persistence of informality. To just get to some numbers, roughly 50% of the workers in India are employed in some sort of a self-employed activity that I was talking about as one of the major parts of the informal sector, who are working in family-based enterprises, not hiring any wage workers, etc. Another quarter of the Indian workforce is employed in casual wage work that gets paid only on a daily basis with no long-term contract. Another quarter is sort of employed in what is called a regular salaried work. It's called regular because it is payment on monthly basis. However, much of it is still without social security benefits, etc. So we are easily talking about upwards of 80% of India's working population being employed in some sort of an informal economy and activity. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about how my work sort of relates in this context with the debates that we talked about. In one of my works, I try to look at how is it that we see the stagnancy in economic structure, right? This transformation not happening from informality to formality. How is it that that gets reflected in how people are deriving their livelihoods? So looking at different sort of employment arrangements through which households can derive their primary economic reproduction, I tried to map it using a panel data over 2 periods of this high growth phase from 2005 to 11-12. And what I really find is that for each of these different employment arrangements across formal, informal, agricultural, non-agriculture, and across self-employment and wage work, about 40 to 70% of households deriving their primary economic reproduction from one of these economic arrangements, in fact, transitions to another one over this time period. But this is also the time period where this movement is sort of paralleled with other set of households transitioning towards these sectors to derive their primary economic reproduction. So what we are seeing in the economy is a huge amount of flux as people are transitioning, and not always to, counterfactually one can see that this is not something that's particularly a great upward mobility, even if people's income and consumptions have increased in India during the growth period, but rather it seems to be driven more by precarity, wherein if they had not probably made this transition, if they were not forced to make this transition, they would have done better off. So that is something how it's reflected that underlying this huge stagnant economic structure is this huge amount of flux, which sort of relates to some of Sanyal's point in terms of where he's talking about there being a continuous reproduction of informal economy despite economic growth. So to go back to Sanyal, one of the things that he says is that unlike in the first world economies or the Western economies or, now the global north, where there was this primitive accumulation that at one point happened, which created the wage work and the workforce, this sort of process is something that continuously goes on happening in the post-colonial economies. And that is the specificity. And what we are seeing is this continuous destruction of self-employment, but a continuous reproduction as well. And not just of this, but also a huge dependence of informal wage work. So wage work, which was earlier seen to be sort of this stable segment of the economy, which would allow people to have better livelihoods, is something for a large part, for example, casual wage work, it's even worse than what one can derive in terms of earnings and livelihoods from the self-employed segment. In another set of works that I've been doing with Snehashish Bhattacharya, we actually try to estimate the possibilities of these self-employed informal enterprises in the Indian economy to grow, accumulate, and themselves be able to undertake this transformation or transition that we've been talking about. And what we find is that, in fact, we calculate an accumulation fund of sorts for these firms of what they can potentially use to accumulate. And what we find is there has been a continuous divergence in the amount of funds that these firms, informal self-employed firms, can retain and what is retained by the growing micro-entrepreneurial kind of firms. So this dualist characteristic of the economy has continued to be reproduced and is continuously growing in the economy. And this process is also highly differentiated along caste lines. And that is something where the marginalized caste groups have much less possibility to grow and transition their enterprises than those from the privileged class. Even if households that are deriving their livelihoods from self-employment, even if they were to transition towards this capitalist segment from wage work, what we see is marginalized castes are much more likely than privileged caste groups to be transitioning to these casual wage work. So the much worse of the informal wage labor as well. So I think that identity element is sort of important to keep in mind as well. I'm going to talk about one more recent work and I'll stop there. And this work is with Rosa Abraham. And one of the things that we are trying to explore using some high frequency panel data from India for one of the very recent periods, just pre-COVID. And what we are finding is this complete absence of a job ladder from informal to formal salaried work. Because in a lot of mainstream theories, it's sort of argued that informality is sort of a stepping stone, right? And this is what we spoke about in different theories also expecting. So what I told you earlier is we do not see these enterprises growing and themselves transitioning, which was one of the paths for this transition. And the other path for the transition is for workers to move from informal employment to this salaried formal work. And we see the complete absence of the job ladder as one of the dominant trajectories that workers can follow. Of course, there'll be some enterprises that will always grow. There'll be some workers who will always transition. But actually, informal work does not act as that sort of stepping stone. We, in fact, try to find the key dominant trajectories in the Indian economy using this high-frequency data, and that's what we find. And one thing that I think that comes out quite starkly from A, the dualist structure is continuing to subsist. B, there's not been that transition that we'd expected. But despite that, it is not a story of complete stagnancy. Given this huge amount of flux, there is this continued reproduction, which is a specificity of post-colonial capitalism that I think is very important to theorize to understand these underlying dynamics. And with which links sort of this new increase in precarity that's happened throughout the world, right? Now it's no more something that exists in the global south. Even if these were considered to be, when I started with the history of reproduction or production of informal economy, I was talking about that how it was attributed to a lack of capitalist transition in these economies. However, now we are in a situation that these markers of informality and precarity are coming into being in economies that have successfully undertaken this capitalist transition. So it's like a southernization of the north that is happening. And I think it is that aspect that we need to understand. And when we think about conversations on future of work in global north, what we need to understand is that for majority of the world, this has been the past and present of work. And therefore, we need to understand whether there are some internal dynamics of our economic system itself that allow for it and that facilitate this sort of reproduction.
Yeah, this is fascinating, really, and such important research that I think captures very well, in a very robust way, how post-colonial economies face this sort of crystallization of the economic structure, while at the same time we see a lot of dynamism if we consider more standard economic indicators, which tells a lot about how we need to improve our understanding of capitalism on a global level, but also that we need to use different indicators of economic activity and social reality in order to understand this fully. So let me move on and conclude with a question on strategies. So what do you think of strategies such as linking these informal firms with formal firms, such as subcontracting, in order to facilitate their growth?
Thanks, Sarah, for the question. In one of my recent works, I in fact explore precisely this role of subcontracting linkages, right? And just to clarify, subcontracting is sort of a marketing agreement or a market agreement between two different firms, usually a contractor, a parent firm, and a bigger firm. And in my case, since I'm studying informal enterprises, the linkage with them in terms of these could be linkages in terms of who they're going to supply their produce to. It could be also that they receive the raw materials and other sorts of design specification from the contractor. So varying levels of autonomy in this sort of a market linkage. So let's think about how is it that the literature expected the role of subcontracting to be. And if we go back to the theories that I was talking about and dualist theories, etc., and even in micro-entrepreneurial theories, the idea was that a lot of these informal firms face some sort of constraints, be it in terms of credit constraint, technological upgradation, market access, etc. So you need to allow these informal firms to get linked with these larger formal firms who will then demand inputs, etc. from them, therefore allowing the growth of these firms as well. And it was expected that this would also allow for a technology transfer to informal firms and help them build their human capital capabilities, etc. So I studied the subcontracting enterprises in India from 2000 to 2016, again, the peak of the growth period. And I studied the subcontracting enterprises in India in the informal sector between 2000 and 2016, which is sort of the peak of the growth period in the Indian economy. And what we see is that, in fact, there has been some fall in the incidence of subcontracting, particularly in the urban segment and particularly in the more sort of relatively micro-entrepreneurial segment of the informal sector. And what I'm finding is that, in fact, subcontracting enterprises have a much lesser possibility to grow, expand, and themselves transition into larger firms than the non-subcontracting ones, which is something that one needs to unpack. And therefore, I go on to analyze what is the nature of these subcontracting linkages. And in the literature, it's been argued that, look, if there's more autonomy that these firms have and there's some sort of a technology transfer, that'll be better for growth potential of the informal firms. But what we find is quite in contrast to that. These subcontracting relationships are such wherein most of the subcontracting firms, the nature of subcontracting is such that subcontracted firms receive raw materials, design from the parent firm or the contractor and supply the entire produce back to them. In fact, these kind of firms that receive the raw materials, designs, and are supplying the whole thing back to the contractor is about 3/4 of all subcontracting firms in the Indian informal sector. And the way I characterize these firms are in a classic sort of, traditional putting out system, wherein they lose almost all autonomy over their production process. The entire production process is in some way from a distance controlled by these big parent firms. However, the labor process remains within these subcontracted firms. And most of these firms, in fact, the subcontracting firms are women-led, are mainly undertaking production within the household, making them that sort of what I characterize and what Sanyal also writes about is this hybrid of a worker in an enterprise. They lose an autonomy of an enterprise. However, they are also not incorporated fully as a worker in the firm, therefore not allowing them to have those kind of worker rights. So these kind of subcontracting linkages, and also there's not really any technology transfer that we see happening for these firms. So these kind of subcontracting linkages, their nature is very different from the dynamic kind that we expect to characterize or facilitate this sort of transition. So often many people talk about subcontracting as some sort of a magic bullet through which it would happen, which is not how it would be. In fact, the last point that I want to make is how a lot of ways of how we think informality can be tackled. Okay, let's provide, these are probably not micro entrepreneurial enough. People also say probably a little bit lazy. So you need to provide them the nudges in order to bring about some behavioral changes in their work, without forgetting the structural logic that we've been talking about, this continuous reproduction of these livelihoods through economic growth process is something that we need to understand, the nature of the growth process itself, rather than trying to look at the symptom of, for example, let me give some credit, let me give some cash transfers, without understanding the role that informal economy is playing today in process of reproduction of post-colonial capitalism. Thank you.
I think that this is an excellent point to end on. Thank you very much, Surbi, for having joined me in this conversation. And you've taken us through a very thorough and I think cutting-edge overview of some of the most critical thinking about the informal economy today.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
This was the first segment of a two-part episode on informal economy and social reproduction in the Global South. In this first segment, we talked about the informal economy with Surbi Kesar, and in the second segment, I will talk about social reproduction.